Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this presentation. It's exciting for me to be inside in the air conditioning for once for a day of work. It's amazing. Like Kyle said, I am one of the trail ambassadors this season for Friends of the Inyo. So normally I am out there picking up trash, dismantling fire rings, hiking miles on those trails that everybody seems to be on this season. It is pretty crazy. I am an amateur angler, budding, I would say, a budding angler. And for the past 7 years, I lived and worked in Yosemite National Park. So I call the Sierra Nevada my home now. Originally, I grew up in San Diego and then was living up in Northern California, up in Humboldt. So California born and raised, but the Sierra Nevada are where home is. So glad to be here and working for Friends of the Inyo. So here on my intro page, I have just some examples of the fish that we'll be talking about today. The golden trout, rainbow trout, the Owens pupfish, and the Paiute cutthroat trout. And this whole presentation was kind of sparked early this season when I was out on the trail at about 9,000 feet and I saw hundreds of fish in what I thought was supposed to be a fishless lake. And I remember somebody years ago told me that they were stalked by airplanes, and I thought that that was absolutely ridiculous. So I decided to research that a little bit and figure out what was happening. So here we have the question that sparked this whole presentation that you guys are here with me for. What fish are native to the Sierra Nevada and how did they get there? To answer this question, we need a really basic understanding of the formation of the Sierra Nevada, because as you can see from this picture on the left, it's pretty rugged and not very easy for a fish to swim upstream to. So here we have a quick little video. There's no audio to it. It's just all visual because visuals are great. But hundreds of millions of years ago, the oceanic crust subducted underneath the continental crust and formed a chain of volcanoes that were kind of the impetus to the Sierra Nevada. And beneath those volcanoes, these bubbles of granitic magma rose and solidified. They're called plutons. And these plutons, over the next couple of millennia, became exposed through erosion. And that's how we have these big granite batholiths like El Capitan and Half Dome. And those became exposed. Then another couple of millennia happened, and about 1.5 million years ago, glaciers formed during the Ice Age, and they advanced and they receded and they advanced and they receded because there were a couple of eras in the Ice Age. And these glaciers carved out the valleys of the Sierra Nevada, and they left behind these scars where all of these alpine lakes now exist. So here is kind of the anatomy of how the alpine lakes were formed, and then a beautiful example on the right-hand side of what they look like. And obviously that doesn't run to the ocean. So explaining how fish got there is kind of a quandary. So here we go. Also, about 5 million years ago, there was more tectonic activity and a significant eastern rise on the eastern escarpment of the Sierra Nevada. So the east side is significantly steeper than the west slope, which you'll see is very significant for what fish we have. Here you can see the major waterways of California on the left-hand side. And obviously, on the west slope, the rivers run to San Francisco or they run down to Los Angeles. And over here on the right-hand side is a little bit zoomed in on just the Sierra Nevada. The rivers on the east side don't run to the ocean. So how did the fish get there? We have two major ocean avenues here in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And we have two major cities that have water rights to the water here in the Sierra Nevada. Therefore, we have a bunch of dams that are obstructing the run for fish as well. On the left, you'll see all of the major, and this is just the major dams. This isn't even all of the dams. The major dams basically at every single major waterway in the Sierra Nevada, which is pretty impactful. So here we have a historic depiction of where fish did not live in the Sierra Nevada. And it's about at the 6,000 foot cutoff. Fish would run up on the west slope and kind of stop around 6,000. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, this black shaded out area is all historically fishless. And then on the right-hand side, we have the major watersheds that make up the Sierra Nevada. So on basically the entire west slope is the Sacramento San Joaquin. Up here in this little blue circle is Eagle Lake. This purple circle is the North Lahontan, and then the green one that's kind of cut off is the Owens Basin. And those all make up all of the major waterways here in the Sierra Nevada. And originally, we had 40 fish that were native to the Sierra Nevada, which is kind of a lot when you think about it. The Sacramento San Joaquin had 22 of those species, obviously, because they run to the ocean, so they're going to have more diversity. The North Lahontan had 10, so this purple one up here. The Eagle Lake and Owens both only had 4 original native fish, which really isn't that much. And here we have just a quick little breakdown of what those species were. So we did have trout, which are kind of the headline sport fish of the Sierra Nevada. But most of the species were suckers and whitefish and little non-sporting fish, quote unquote, non-sporting. So the trout are considered the sport fish because of their reputation for putting up a good fight, being good food as well, and also being really easy to plant historically. So here is a historic range of the waters of the heritage trout. And in the Sierra Nevada, those are the highlighted ones that I have over here in yellow. We have the rainbow trout, so the coastal rainbow on the west side. And then we have the Eagle Lake rainbow trout, Kern River rainbow, the Lahontan cutthroat, the Paiute cutthroat, the little Kern golden, and the California golden. And if you want to notice over here in the Owens Basin, there aren't any trout that are historically native. So first I have to comment on the first people who were here thousands of years before European settlers and their relationship with the native fish that were here in the Sierra Nevada. There were 3 major groups of people under the same name. There are many sub-tribes within those people, but the 3 major ones, we have the Mono people, the Eastern and the Western Mono, and then the Miwok. So for the Eastern Mono, otherwise known as the Owens Paiute, they lived mostly up around Mono Lake and the eastern region, and they weren't very nomadic. They had really advanced systems of irrigation and water jurisdictions and rules that they applied to the seasons and which fish you could take and when you could take them and who could take them and things like that. Fish were not only a source of food, but they were a commodity. So from Mono Lake, they would harvest brine shrimp and dry them and trade. So it was a pretty complex relationship they had with the native fish of the area. And then we had the Western Mono, otherwise known as Monash. They were more nomadic, but they always lived along waterways. So obviously fish played an important role in their lives. And then the Miwok were on the western side. They're the biggest group of native people in California. So they ranged all the way out to the coast, up into the Sierra Nevada, and they are renowned for their basket weaving. So over here on the left-hand side, we have a Miwok woman weaving a basket, and they caught fish with fish nets and fish baskets, and traded them as well, dried them, kept them for food during the winter. It was a really important, integral part of their way of life. And they practiced a balance with it before European settlers came along. So these are actually examples of northern Yurok tribes with a wooden dam on the Klamath over here and some long pole nets fishing on the Klamath or the Eel River as well. There wasn't very good documentation of native people's way of life back then. These were the best examples that I could come up with, though, even though they're not specific to the Sierra Nevada, but very similar kind of relationship with the land that they had. So European settlers came to California as Western expansion continued, starting in the early 1800s. So up in the left-hand side, we have Joseph Redford Walker. He was an infamous trapper and probably one of the first European people to get into the Sierra Nevada. According to records, they either entered into Hetch Hetchy or Yosemite Valley based off of descriptions of journals that they had with these huge granite walls that they came into. And that was in 1833. So after Joe, we had a bunch more expeditions come through. So he came into the Sierra Nevada, stopped at the Sierra Nevada, and then went back, got more people, came back. He never crossed all the way over until later on. And there were expeditions year after year following the seasons. And so in 1848, the gold rush happens, which brings hordes of people. And then 1850, California becomes a state. 1867 is the first railroad, and it's completed later on. So here we have just a little visual map of the course that people took to get over onto the West Coast, and then a timeline for that, and then a corresponding population growth too. 1840, approximately 8,000 people, and this wasn't including native people in their census. It was just the white settlers that they were including here. But approximately 8,000 people. And then it grows exponentially each decade after that, which is astounding. And so the relationship with the wildlife and having sources of food and depleting that food was becoming a pretty big concern around 1870. And in 1871, the Board of Fish Commissioners was established in California. It was the first board that had restoration and preservation in mind. It was the first of its kind in the United States, in California here. And it was pretty revolutionary. As people settled more and more, we developed canneries and we started hydromining, which is basically just shooting cannons of water into the ground. And imagine how impactful that is with the runoff and harming the habitat for these native species. So we were doing a lot of damage as we were coming over. And as we were coming over, we were stalking the fish. So Joseph would come over with a party. This party would have fingerling fish in coffee cans or whatever watertight container. They would stock these fish into previously fishless lakes and streams, or previously not with that species, lakes and streams, so that future expeditions could have a food source. We came over with sugar and flour and staples, but also seeds and livestock and fish, so that we could continue to eat for generations to come. And so stocking became a big part of going west. Up here in the left-hand corner, we have a picture of one of the very first ever fish hatcheries here in California. And down in the lower, this was the earliest photo that I could find of the Board of Fish Commissioners, which is 1873, which isn't the original, but close thereafter. So a quick little history of the practice of stocking. We were not novel. This had been happening for hundreds of years in Europe, but the earliest record of fish stocking is from China, and it's from 2100 BC, which is a very long time ago. And there's a text that references when to harvest eggs and how to go about doing that and when to replant them. And then the Aztecs, they had aquaponics, and that relied on fish species. So they would take fish from one canal and relocate them to another canal where they needed more fish. And then in Europe, they were a couple of centuries ahead of America. And because of their rising populations and impacts that had, in 1741 is the first historical reference, or the first recorded fish hatchery in Westphalia. So we had been stocking fish for a very long time, and we just kind of brought that practice along with us as we moved further west. So as I said, the Board of Commissions was created in 1871, but prior to that, some kind of important timeline events. In 1849, California adopts English law before it becomes a state. And that's kind of important because before that, it was subject to Spanish and Mexican law. And they didn't really explore into the Sierra Nevada. The Spanish were the ones to name the Sierra Nevada, the huge white snowy range, right? But they were more focused on establishing missions on the coast. So they didn't really travel east in California. And then in 1850, California becomes a US state. In 1851, there is the first law that revolves around fish and aquaculture. And it's about oysters and who can collect oysters and when they can collect oysters. So 1861, people are already starting to get a little bit concerned about fish populations. The human population has skyrocketed, and they've noticed that fish populations aren't skyrocketing either. So they close a season for trout, which is pretty cool. And then 1871, the Board of Fish Commissioners is established. 1872, shortly thereafter, is the first official fish hatchery here in California. Before that, we have records that there were kind of private or pirate fish hatcheries here in California, but that was the first official recorded one. In 1874, we receive our first shipment of brook trout from the East Coast via railroad. And then in 1883, we received brown trout from Germany. We also export rainbow trout to the East Coast and to Europe as well. And then what else do we have? We're going to skip forward to, oh, here's that railroad delivery. And then over on the left-hand side is just a picture of what they call the milking process of collecting eggs from females and artificially inseminating them. This is what the process looked like back then. And so in 1913, the Board of Fish Commissioners, which is now the Department of Fish and Game, so they have adopted, they're not just about fish and aquaculture, they've now adopted game laws underneath their jurisdiction as well. But the first angling license is required because the Board of Fish Commissioners needs money to be able to regulate who can fish and when. And all of the proceeds from the fishing licenses go directly back to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this isn't related to fish at all, but in 1922, the last grizzly bear is reported shot here in California, which I thought was sad. So here are just some photos of how they went about preserving the population of the fish is the banner under which they put stocking. So we have some milk cans over here in the lower right-hand corner being carried out by mule. And then local private clubs like the Sierra Club would come and pick up boxes of fish and go stock them at whatever lakes they felt like. And then the Department of Fish and Wildlife would regularly schedule stocking as well. So after World War II, we had all of these planes just sitting there, not doing anything, and all of these pilots just sitting there, not doing anything. So the fleets were converted into either wildfire tankers, so they would go put out wildfires, or tankers for fish stocking as well. And this on the left-hand side is just a picture of the extreme accuracy that a pilot would have to drop fish into these alpine lakes. And this is really how we got fish way up into some of our most remote lakes. Yeah, they had to be pretty accurate. They couldn't just waste a tank full of fish and dump them on the ground. So, yeah. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and it kind of predicted a pretty gruesome future if we continued to use pesticides. And that spurred a lot of wildlife activism in the 60s. And that's how the Endangered Species Preservation Act came about in 1966. That was the first iteration of the Endangered Species Act. And on that original list, there were 22 fish, and a few of them were here in the Sierra Nevada. So we were starting to realize the ramifications of our previous actions and understanding that stocking wasn't necessarily the best practice. And in the 1970s, they stopped stocking lakes in national parks altogether, which is pretty cool. But you'll still find a lot of the lakes still have populations even decades later. They've stopped stocking, but fish are pretty good at reproducing. So with the Endangered Species Act, the pupfish over here in the lower right-hand corner was on that original list, and it has only expanded since 1966. But some major considerations that we had to make for the pupfish were the introduction of non-native trout, the brook trout and the brown trout specifically, because they're voracious eaters They're highly competitive. They're really predative as well. And they can hybridize with native fish and breed out native populations of native fish. So those two species in particular are really harmful. And then we have the yellow-legged frog, who is also on the endangered species list. And they live at higher elevations where typically there were not fish present before. And when we introduced fish, it was highly problematic because their lifespan, they're tadpoles for multiple seasons because they're exposed at such low temperatures and they're at such high elevations. So they could be a tadpole for 2, even up to 4 seasons. And that's a really long time span to be this tiny vulnerable tadpole. You're basically bait for the equivalent of great white sharks in your previously fishless lake. So the brook trout and the brown trout eat everything and anything, which is really problematic for the endemic species to the area. Another consideration to take is that the Owens pupfish, their habitat has been considerably decreased due to cattle grazing and human intervention with diversion of waterways, things like that. So both of these species, it's not just the introduction of non-native fish that have impacted them, but it's one of the major players in the severe decline in their populations. I mean, the Owens pupfish was almost considered extinct, and they've rebounded. So that's good. But what we are doing these days to try to mitigate those consequences are eradicating the non-native species and then supporting the repopulation of native species with hatcheries, with heritage hatcheries. So up in the upper left-hand corner, we have a hatchery, and they're repopulating the golden trout and repopulating Paiute and Lahontan cutthroat. So that's beneficial for the ecosystem. But then to eradicate the non-native species, they do one of three things. Back in the day, they used to use rotenone, which is a pesticide, and they would just shock entire ponds, entire lakes. And it was problematic because rotenone is indiscriminate. It'll kill all of the fish. It'll kill all of the frogs. It'll kill all of the snails. There's no way that you can kind of select. You just wipe everything out with that pesticide. And you could also use gill nets, but those only catch the older, bigger fish. They don't catch the smaller fingerling fish. So in a lot of the studies that I was reviewing, they would get to 99% eradication, and then a couple of years later they would come back and the population had rebounded because all of these smaller fish had reproduced. So these days the more popular method is electroshock, which you can see in these 2 pictures on the right hand side. So we have a boat with electroshock probes sticking out from it, and they zap the water, stun the fish. They don't kill the fish, but that way the biologists or the rangers or whoever it is that's out there can more selectively go through the fish that are floating up. And that way you don't hurt the native species, hopefully, and you can just cull the ones that you wanted to. And then down here in the lower bottom corner, lower right-hand corner, they're electroshocking with backpacks, which is a way more selective way to go about doing it. So, in summary, I would say if you're going out fishing, if you're interested in fishing here in Sierra Nevada, definitely look up the regulations that apply to the region that you're in. And that's what this URL up in the upper left-hand corner is. It's an interactive map. So if you know that you're going to go up to the Mammoth Lakes Basin, you can click on the Mammoth Lakes Basin within that URL, and it'll tell you exactly how many fish you can catch, how many you can keep, how big they have to be, or how little they have to be, what species you have to throw back, if you can have barbs on your hook, if you can fish with live bait. Introducing worms to some ecosystems is really dangerous. So know what you are allowed to fish with and what you're allowed to keep. I know that up in Mammoth Lakes at McLeod Lake, it's only catch and release because it's golden trout. So you can't keep golden trout. But everywhere else, it's fair game. And if you're 16 or older, you have to have at least a day fishing license. And all of the proceeds from that go directly back to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And restoring these populations and keeping the ecosystems healthy and trying to undo the damage that we've done over the years. So here are a few organizations that you can look into if you're interested in supporting keeping the pupfish alive or getting them off of the endangered species list, or how to keep heritage trout programs going as well. So yeah. And then we had a member submit this book, which I didn't get a chance to read because it was submitted to me last night when I was already done putting this presentation together. But it looks like it would have been a really handy resource to look at because it's basically this entire presentation in book form. But it's a history of the Eastern Sierra hatcheries, and it looks like a pretty interesting read because it's a lot of Old West cowboy mentality back then, which is always fun to read. And so that's about it. If anybody has questions, submit them to Kyle and we'll see where it takes us.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm trying to join you with my screen. Yeah, so I will also share a link to that book that you can find on Amazon. It's an ebook that you can get for your Kindle. But yeah, shout out to Michael Sharkey. Thank you for sending that out to us. I read a little portion of it, and it was so interesting. I couldn't get through all of it in the past few days, but I'm definitely going to take a closer look, and I was glad to send that along to Lindsay. So I'm just going to look to see if we had any questions come through. We had just a few. Here's one from Craig. It's what is the status of the golden trout, Lindsay?
The golden trout is still endangered. They aren't very susceptible to repopulation. They don't like being in hatcheries, so a lot of it has to happen just naturally. And in one of the slides, you can see their region there is pretty small. So yeah, unfortunately, they're still threatened.
Wow. Another question. I don't remember if you answered this one in the presentation, but the two invasive species, the ones that you talked about, the brown trout and the is it the brook trout?
Yeah.
Where are those originally from?
So the brook trout is from the east coast of United States, and then the brown trout came from Germany.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question come in. Let's see. This person says, I thought I heard that CFG was going to plant fish in the lower Owens, south of Big Pine, the part of the river where they expanded it and added some water. Has this ever been done?
I am not sure about that.
Yeah. I'm not sure either. If anyone else knows the answer, you can message in the chat box. I'm not sure, but we can look into it. If you want to email me, you can email me at Kyle@friendstheinyo with your question, and I'll follow up with you. Go ahead and keep the questions coming in. We got a few here. All right. P. Barney says, are the lakes in the high Sierras still being stocked? For example, in Sabrina Basin, are any of the lakes still seeded, Blue, Midnight, or Moonlight? Do you know, Lindsay?
I'm not sure about those specific lakes. I know that in national parks, none of the lakes are being stocked anymore. I am uncertain about the surrounding wildernesses, though. We do still stock in Mammoth, so my guess is probably yes.
Lindsay, within wilderness, are there any rules against stocking fish?
No. Well, if you go and do it yourself, there's a hefty fine.
Sure.
Because it could be in an impacted ecosystem where they're trying to bring back the yellow-legged frog or something like that. So I would highly not recommend that.
Yeah. Okay, another question from Janet. Do you know anything about fossil fish found in sediments below Mono Lake found when drilling for oil? That's an interesting question. Do you know?
I know nothing.
I don't know that one either.
That could be my next presentation.
Yeah. We did have maybe an answer for a previous question from John. John says that Lower Owens has been colonized by warmer species from above the dewatered section. Warm water species from above the dewatered section. Yeah, I do know that the pupfish is only found in just a few places in California, and I believe in maybe Ash Meadows, Nevada. But the pupfish's habitat is greatly reduced. I know it's found in Shoshone, and there's some like secret ponds that they're like trying to rehabilitate them in, things like that.
Yeah, there are 5 populations of specifically the Owens pupfish here.
Okay.
Or like 5 little pockets, and their populations fluctuate. I saw as little as 64 individuals up to 1,000. So they kind of ebb and flow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, John. I think I may be talking about a different species. You were talking about the Owens.
Well, the Owens is its own pupfish, but then there are different varieties of pupfish.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. Read through some of these. Okay, Allison has a good question here. She says that lakes like Saddlebag and Silver Lake are importing and stocking fish from Oregon. Since the fish in the local fisheries all had to be euthanized due to the bacteria. But do you know when the local fish hatcheries may be back up and restocked? Yeah.
So I know that 3 of our local fish hatcheries, they did have to euthanize about 3.2 million fish in July of this year because they basically had the fish equivalent of strep. And that was a point I meant to talk about, sorry, that hatcheries aren't the most hygienic environments for fish to grow up in. If one fish gets sick, they can't socially distance in a big pool. And so then they all get sick, and they don't want to introduce that into the wilderness. So the hatcheries aren't necessarily the most reliable way of getting fish out there. I don't know when our local hatcheries are going to rebound from that, because it takes time for the next generation of fish to get big enough to be planted. So who knows? And also, who knows when the next weird variant of strep is going to hit another fishery somewhere. It's really kind of apropos of the moment.
Sure, yeah. Let's see, another question. Do you have any information on fishing in Owens Lake before it was dewatered?
Well, the Owens Basin drained and Owens Lake was its terminus. So presumably there were all of those all 4 of those fish there present. But yeah, Owens Lake doesn't exist anymore. So I don't know if it was planted ever or what the history is.
Yeah, I'd be curious too, because I bet that the lake was very saline because of all the salt. So I wonder. I don't know the answer to that one too, but again, if you want to email me, I will follow up with you with the answers to the question. Let's see, if anyone has any last questions, we'll start wrapping it up. Questions are slowing down, but these are all great questions. Do you have any last thoughts, Lindsay, before we start wrapping it up?
No, just thanks for being here. Get a fishing license.
Yeah. And you told me to get a lifetime fishing license.
Well, when you were 16, get a fishing license. Oh. It pays for itself that way.
Right. Perfect. Let's see. Do you happen to know where someone can go to find out what High Sierra lakes are stocked and which may be in recovery?
I tried really, really hard to find that information, and they're pretty secretive about which lakes they've eradicated from. I think it's because they don't want pirate people to go and restock them. Oh, wow. So I think it's pretty protected information on which lakes have been eradicated. But if you want to find a stocking schedule, that is on the Department of Fish and Wildlife website. So you can find where fish are being put.
Got it. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna add this link again to the chat so everyone can have it. It's where you can go to find the regulations on all areas, I think, of California, the fishing regulations. So you can go there, and it's an interactive map. You can click on areas, and it'll tell you exactly what the limits are for what kind of different fish. It was very, very useful. I'd never seen it before. So Lindsay, thanks for sharing that with us. With that, I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up. So thank you everyone again for joining. If you have any questions or you want to follow up at all with this presentation from Lindsay, you can email me at kyle@friendsoftheinyo.org. Thank you everyone for joining, and take care.
Thanks, guys.